the flights. We were Tripp and Heather Flight, and we would like to welcome you from our home to our online service this morning. If you're a guest, we would especially like to welcome you as well. You know, it's easy a lot of times to kind of sit back in the shadows or sit behind whatever screen you're watching on, but especially in this time of isolation, we've all been cooped up in our homes. We would love to just get to know you. So please reach out to us. We are a church of community and we need each other. Reach out, tell us how we can pray for you or just how we can serve you. You can reach out to one of our pastors either through the app you're watching on now, or you can email them at life@exchangenc.org.
As Pastor Brian mentioned last week, we are going to have an opportunity to gather together in person very soon on June 7th. We will be meeting at the Millbridge Nature Park. We will have 2 different times to accommodate social distancing guidelines, 5 and 6:30. And we're asking that you guys go online and register so we can plan accordingly. There's a link in the latest, the email that's sent out every Wednesday, so we just ask that you do that. And we just hope that it is an encouraging time as we pray together and sing together and take the Lord's Supper. So we hope to see you there.
Yes, definitely looking forward to seeing everyone together in person. Once again, feels like forever. So Heather and I would just like to encourage you with some Bible verses that we read together as a family this past week that encouraged us, and I hope that it encourages you as well. It comes from Jeremiah chapter 9, verses 23 and 24. Let not the wise boast of their wisdom, or the strong boast of their strength, or the rich boast of their riches, but let the one who boasts boast about this, that they have the understanding to know me, that I am the Lord who exercises kindness, justice, and righteousness on earth, for in these I delight, declares the Lord.
We hope that through our time together this morning that you're left encouraged and challenged and just reminded of God's goodness to you. So let's sing together now and remind ourselves of those truths.
Well, good morning, Exchange. It's so good to be with you again this week. As we do every week, we just want to, this morning, together sing and remind ourselves of what is true, to praise the God who has been so good to us. And so, if you will, let's sing together. All the worries of this world, I will lay them at your feet. Surrender every anxious thought for perfect peace, your perfect peace. And all the loved ones I hold dear, and all my hopes and dreams and all my fears, and I will choose to trust your name in everything, in everything. I will look up, and I will look up, for there is none above you, and I will bow down to tell you that I need you, Jesus, Lord of Lords. Jesus, Lord of Lords. I will take you, and I will take you at your word. Jesus, you have taken hold of me, and all my life is in your hands. You are my strength. You are my strength. And I will look up, for there is none above you. And I will bow down to tell you that I need you, Jesus, Lord of all. And I will Prince of Peace. Prince of Peace, perfect healer, and all my life, and all my cares on you, King of Kings, mighty Savior, and all my life, and all my cares on you, Prince of Peace, perfect healer, and all my life, and all my cares on you, King of Kings, mighty Savior, and all my life, and all my cares on you, my cares on you, Lord. Sing, I will look up. I will look up, for there is none above you. I will bow down to tell you that I need you, Jesus, Lord of all. And I will look back and see that you are able. I'll look ahead, believing you are able, Jesus, Lord of all. Jesus, Lord of all. Our God is Jesus, Lord of all. Yes, oh, Jesus, Lord of all. Sing that chorus one more time, I will. And I will look up, for there is none above you. And I will bow down to tell you that I need you, Jesus, Lord of all. And I will look back and see that you are faithful. I look ahead, believing you are able, Jesus, Lord of all. Jesus, Lord of all. The grace of God has reached for me, pulled me from the raging sea, and I am safe on the solid ground. The Lord is my salvation.
I will not fear when darkness falls. His strength will help me scale these walls. I'll see the dawn of the rising sun. The Lord is my salvation.
ours each promise of His word. When winter fades, I know spring will come. The Lord is my salvation.
In times of waiting, times of need, when I know lost, when I am weak, I know His grace will renew these days. The Lord is my salvation.
Who is like the Lord our God, strong to save, faithful in love? My debt is paid and the victory won. The Lord is my salvation. And who is like the Lord our God, strong to save, faithful in love? My debt is paid and the victory won. The Lord is my salvation. Glory to the God the Father. Glory be to God the Son. Glory be to God the Spirit. The Lord is our salvation. And glory be to God the Father. Glory be to God the Son. Glory be to God the Spirit. The Lord is our salvation. Who is like the Lord our God, strong to save, faithful in love? My debt is paid and the victory won. The Lord is my salvation. The Lord is my salvation. The Lord is my salvation.
What gift of grace is Jesus my Redeemer? There is no more for heaven now to give. He is my joy, my righteousness and freedom, my steadfast love, my deep and boundless peace. To this I hold, my hope is only Jesus. but through Christ in me. No fate I dread, I know I am forgiven. The future sure, the price it has been paid. For Jesus bled and suffered for my pardon, and he was raised to overthrow the grave. To this I hold, my sin has been defeated. Jesus now and ever is my plea. Oh, the chains are released. I can sing. I am free, yet not I, but through Christ in me. With every breath, I long to follow Jesus, for he has said that he will bring me home. And day by day, I know he will renew me until I stand with joy before the throne. To this I hold, my hope is only Jesus. All the glory evermore to him. When the race is complete, still my lips shall repeat, yet not I, but through Christ in me. To this I hold, my hope is only Jesus. All the glory evermore to him. When the race is complete, still my lips shall repeat, yet not I, but through Christ in me. When the race is complete, still my lips shall repeat.
Well, good morning, Exchange. I hope that you're doing well. And as we continue through the book of Genesis, I want to remind you that the passages that we use each week are available in the YouVersion app. And so if you're at home and using your device, or maybe we go through the passages a little quickly, which we're going to use a lot of passages, a lot of scripture today, that's available throughout the week. And if you log on to that, you can reference those verses, you can make notes, and you can see those passages as we progress forward. So just want to remind you of that. So I have files in my office that aren't complete, files on my desktop, on my computer, that are just literally waiting for more information. I don't know if you have files like that. Maybe you have the old school like file folder thing, and you're just constantly putting information in there. For me, on my desktop, as I get more information, as I search to complete a file, I leave it really close to access, and I just dump files and folders in those compacted folders. And so the point is that I can get to them quickly, and then when I'm finished with those, I file them away to a place where I can keep them, and I know. But the point is, until that I have all the information, I want to keep it close. And so I think as I thought about that, maybe you even have like, in January, you start a folder for your taxes. And maybe as information starts to come in, you wait for information from your bank or from us or from different corporations, and you're waiting for more information so that you can complete the task that you've been given. It's pretty impossible to file your taxes without all the information. It's pretty impossible to file your taxes with all the information, actually, I think. But if you can imagine getting one piece of paper, maybe your mortgage statement, and going to your tax accountant and say, okay, can you fill this out for me? They would just simply reply, I can't do it until I have all the information. And I feel like Joseph lived his life with a stack full of folders on his desks and on his desktop that were just files waiting for more information. I feel like Joseph's life was full of maybe just a piece of the puzzle, maybe just a picture of what was going to happen, but certainly not the complete story. But what we see is that Joseph learned to live his life in that context. I mean, if you remember, you have Joseph from a young age is hated by his family, his brothers, loved by his father. It created so much jealousy and strife and envy and all those things. And then he's thrown into a pit. He's falsely accused. He's thrown in prison. He's forgotten about. And finally, when he's 30 years old, 13 years after he's sold into slavery, he stands before Pharaoh and he figures out, hey, wait a second, there's a purpose behind all of these other things. It's as if Joseph got the last piece of paper to put in that file, and he was like, oh, okay, now this makes sense. Now, all the other things, all the other papers, all the other files, all the little pieces to the puzzle that didn't seem to fit before, that didn't seem to make sense, all of a sudden, when Joseph is 30 years old, now he gets out of prison, he stands before Pharaoh, he interprets this dream. Pharaoh puts him in charge of all of Egypt for the next many years. He's suddenly confronted with the completed file that says, this is why, Joseph. This is the reason. And I think Joseph learned to live life with that lens, that he would trust God until the file was complete. While the file was being completed, he would trust God. He learned to live life with this lens of the providence of God. The providence of God is simply stated that there is a sovereign God who sees all things, who knows all things, who also has a perfect plan. And he might not reveal that plan to us. In fact, many times he doesn't, but that's where faith comes in. You cling to God, and you know that he has all the power to work out all the things in this natural world working supernaturally. And because we know him, we're often able to look back at some point and to see how things make sense. And for some of us, for some of our stories, we're given the privilege, like Joseph, at some point in our earthly lives to look back and say, oh, now that makes sense. Now I get and I understand why those files were stacking up on my desktop. Now I get and understand why that file that wasn't so pleasant, why that experience that wasn't great, I get why that fits in this folder. But for some of us, it won't be, I don't believe, until heaven that we understand the mind of God. Certainly for some of us, we struggle in that process. I believe Jacob, Joseph's father, did not really learn to live life with that lens. Jacob is often struggling in life. In fact, the first time we meet Jacob, he's struggling. If you remember, in the womb, he's struggling with his brother Esau. Their mother goes to God and says, why, if you've promised me children, is there so much turmoil inside of me? And the Spirit of God says, it's because there's struggle, there's strife. Even then, Jacob was struggling. And towards the end of Jacob's life, we see even more struggle. We see struggle to survive. These folders that didn't make quite a lot of sense, and he would resort to running, or he would leave, and he would avoid confrontation. He sought comfort, all of these things. And I think as he's struggling even now in our passage to make sense of what everything's going on, there's a famine, his sons have left, there's this mysterious judge or ruler in Egypt that's asking them to bring back his son Benjamin. I mean, there's a lot of things that Jacob is struggling with and for. And as he's struggling, I believe he sees his sons coming back from Egypt, now all of them, and they're carrying much more with them than they brought back or intended to bring back. In fact, there's camels and chariots and carts. There's all kinds of things going on and coming back to Jacob. And so as there's this caravan coming with them, and he learns at this point that Joseph is still alive. In fact, this mysterious ruler, this judge, this person who's and somewhat tormenting his family is not an evil-spirited person, but it's his son Joseph who lives. And we pick up in the text at that point where Jacob has more information to put with his file. We see that as Jacob is going to struggle through this, we see his small movements in the great and grand story of God. There's this fascinating story about a Polish composer, Ignacy Paderewski, where a young mother took her young son to watch this famous pianist and composer. And so as they were coming in and taking as soon as she left, the son started to venture away. And he ventured off to a side hallway, which led to a back hallway, which led to a door that said no admittance. And so the way that the story goes is he wasn't exactly sure what admittance was, but he didn't have any, so he pushed through the door and found himself on stage at the piano before the composer went on. So as the mother's talking to her friends a few rows back, she hears the sound of the piano, and it begins to sound not like a composer. In fact, it was a very familiar sound to the mother. It was Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. And so the little boy had began to play his only known piece of music. And at that point, the composer comes around and he sits down beside the boy at the piano. The mother is embarrassed. She's trying to flag her son down to get off the stage. At some point, I'm sure she tries to hide her face or any relation to the boy. But at that point, the composer reaches around with his left hand and starts playing bass notes along with Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. And he whispers in the boy's ear, he says, don't stop playing. And at that point, he reaches around with his right hand and he starts to play these obligato, staccato notes along with it, and the audience erupts. They love it. And I can imagine at some point the boy was tempted to think that he was the star of the show. I'm sure at some point he could think that maybe his Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star was played like no other Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star had ever been played. But in fact, it was because the composer had wrapped his arms around and started to complete this piece, this masterpiece that only included his small part. And I think at this part in the story, Jacob might feel a little bit like that boy, where he's doing some things start to make sense. Maybe even he learns that Joseph is alive and he thinks, okay, maybe my life hasn't all been terrible the way that I thought it was. He will say even later on in the passage that his days have been short and evil, and then all of these things. And then he thinks, okay, maybe God is doing these things and maybe it's through me. Jacob is 130 years old at this point. So we're going to pick up in 46 verse 1. And he says this, so Israel, Jacob, set out with all that he had, and he came to Beersheba and offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. So Jacob was living in a place called Hebron. and he was going down to a place called Beersheba. We've talked about this place before, and we've mentioned it several times in our study through Genesis. It was a significant place to Jacob's father Isaac and Jacob's grandfather Abraham. Beersheba was a place where Abraham and Isaac both built altars and called upon the name of the Lord. So it's possible, if you can imagine, that Jacob went to Beersheba and maybe uncovered, maybe he found the altars that his grandfather or father had built. Maybe he repaired them. Maybe he built onto them. Maybe he used them, and he called upon the name of the Lord. I'm sure that was a powerful moment for him. And the passage indicates that while he was there, he was fearful. I think he was fearful for going down to Egypt. He was fearful for leaving his home. He was fearful for leaving his country. I mean, if you can imagine, he's 130 years old, lived mostly only in one place for a very long time, carrying all of his possessions, his family, all these things. In Egypt, let's just remember, Egypt had not been really kind to his family. Abraham goes to Egypt because of a famine. He almost sabotages the will and the promise of God there, where he tries to give Sarah away to anyone who wants to marry her. He passes her off as his sister to preserve his life. Isaac did something very similar, almost sabotaging the will of God. And it's very possible or probable that Sarah brought Hagar from Egypt, and then later she gave Hagar to Abraham, that bore Ishmael. I mean, Egypt was not a good place. It was not a good place for the children of God. Abraham and Isaac both disobeyed God in going to them. So I can imagine that Jacob was very trepid. He was very fearful about Egypt. And so verse 2 and verse 4, God speaks to him and he confronts Jacob's fear. And he says, Jacob, Jacob. He said, I'm here. And he said, I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you a great nation there. He renews this promise again. And I will go down with you to Egypt, and I will surely bring you up again. And Joseph will close your eyes. So this seems like the most pleasant worship experience that Jacob has had up until this point. You can remember the other encounters that he has with God are filled with fear and wrestling. He's on the run from his life, apprehensive about reuniting with Esau. He actually wrestles with God at one point and comes away crippled for the rest of his life. I mean, but this time it's different. God goes to Jacob and he offers peace and his presence. And he says, Jacob, I don't want you to be afraid. I want you to go down with confidence. And he renews the promise that he gave to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. When there were no heirs, do you remember this? God gives a promise. And God extends that promise back to Jacob. He extends it in two ways. He says this, I will be with you. And this is a promise that we've seen over and over and over again, all the way since Genesis 12 and the story of Abraham, when God calls Abram out of his country and he says, don't be afraid, I will be with you. He extends the promise to Isaac, Jacob's father, and he says, don't be afraid, I will be with you. And he again extends it to Jacob, and he says, Jacob, go down to Egypt, don't be afraid, I will be with you. We've talked about this promise many times at Exchange. And it's the promise that God gives to his children, and it's the promise that he will never leave us or forsake us. And because of that, God commands us not to fear. Here's the truth. The presence of God is enough to displace our fear. The presence of God, God believes, is enough to displace our fear. You get the visual of a boat that's going down into the water, and as this boat displaces the water, it's as if the presence of God comes into the situation and pushes out fear. So the question is, why would Jacob be afraid? What was he afraid of? Well, I want to take you back to Genesis chapter 15, because there's a promise in Genesis chapter 15 from God to Abraham that I believe Jacob was very aware of. This is what it says in verse 12. He says, now when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram, and behold, a terror and great darkness fell upon him. And God said to Abram, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs. Could this be Egypt? But notice what he says. He says, where they will be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. Now, Jacob knew that this has not happened yet, but it was going to. And then he says this. He says, but I will judge the nation whom they serve, and afterward they will come out with many possessions. And as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace, and you will be buried at a good old age. And then in the fourth generation they will return here, for the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. So there's this promise to Abraham that his descendants are going to go into a nation, a foreign nation, and there be enslaved for 400 years. I believe that Jacob had to have known about this promise and enlightenment from God. And I wondered if Jacob believed that he might be leading his children into this enslavement or a trap. Let's be honest, Jacob tended to avoid conflict and difficulty. He ran from confrontation. He sought comfort. So I wonder if this was a fear for Jacob, even though God had said that he would be the one to bring them in and bring them out. I wonder if Jacob was afraid. After all, this was not the will of God for Abraham to go to Egypt. It was not the will of God for Isaac to go to Egypt. And yet he feels like he's being asked to go to Egypt. And I believe that Romans 1, actually 12, verse 1 through 3 actually speak to this. And it says this, therefore I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present, watch this, your bodies a living and holy sacrifice acceptable to God, which is your reasonable or spiritual service of worship. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, watch this, so that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect for you. I think there's this very singular purpose here where there's a will of God that's universal, but there's also a will of God that's very, very specific, right? And so while we see this, while it was not God's will for Abraham to go to Egypt, it was not God's will for Isaac to go to Egypt, it was very much God's will for Jacob to go to Egypt. And I think what we have to learn from this is that what God's will for someone else may not be for you. Or what God's will for your life and God's push on your life might not be the same push, might not be the same conviction, might not even be the same belief that he pushes on someone else. You know, I think we have to be clear here that it wasn't about Egypt. It's not as if Egypt was a sinful place or not a sinful place to go. It was kind of a neutral place, right? It was the why. Why did they go to Egypt? Because Abraham and Isaac sought provision there instead of from God. Why was God calling Jacob to Egypt? Because he wanted him to obey in the face of difficult circumstances. So every time we pursue the will of God, I think we have to understand and realize why God might be asking us to do this. And why God might be asking someone to do something else. Maybe we won't get those answers, but we do have to know that they could be totally different. Scripture's clear that one belief, one conviction might not be universal for us all. And if I could just take a time out for 1 second here, I think this is a good point and a good time to say that in this culture, in this environment, there is beginning to be a lot of disunity, even in and amongst the church, on how we respond to cultural things. And so we have this opportunity to respond differently, and we have this opportunity to judge or to simply live our lives in a good conscience of how God has asked us to. You know, Scripture's clear, there's certainly universal commands, but there's also preferences and beliefs. There's a universal will of God for those who know and follow Christ, and yet there's very specific and special plans for your life. And so I think it's very good for us to understand that there are freedoms that that we have that others might not have. And so I want to encourage you in this way. If you see your brothers or sisters acting or responding differently, I'm going to be really specific, to regulations, heavily suggested or recommended practices, and all the stuff, here's what I would suggest. Absolutely refuse to pass judgment. In this case where Satan is looking for just a small foothold to tear the church apart, we have the opportunities as we pass each other in the grocery stores, or hopefully at church at some point, or maybe in backyards or small groups or summer groups. We have the opportunity to look at others and how they respond to these things and completely pass judgment. And what Scripture's clear is that if their conscience is pushing them towards one thing, then that's good for them to do. But also Scripture is very clear that we're not all bound to that one thing. And while we would look out for our weaker brothers, while we would look out for those and cause no one to stumble, we need to be clear that there's a lot of preferences and a lot of different beliefs that we have the opportunity to give grace to everybody, that they might respond differently to the cultural setting that we are right now. And so the first thing that we should say is, how am I going to honor God by the way that I respond? How am I going to care for my brothers and sisters by the way that I respond? Is the way that I respond only a selfish act? I mean, there's certain filters that we would put these things through, but I want to encourage you, if above all other things, put this one in, refuse judgment. Just refuse judgment. Don't let this be a divisive issue. Don't let what God is pushing on one person to do and not pushing on another person to do cause judgment. Can you imagine what Abraham's response or Isaac's response would have been to Jacob if Jacob could have told them, hey, God's telling me to go to Egypt. Yeah, right. I'll tell you what happened when I went to Egypt. I almost blew everything. There's no way, Jacob, that God is actually telling you to go to Egypt. That's the last place God would ever tell you to go to. Could you imagine what Jacob would say to his father and grandfather, how he was trying to convince that what was wrong for them was actually God's will for him? I mean, it doesn't seem right. It doesn't seem clear. But what Scripture is clear about is God will send us down these individual paths and give his purpose and push those files into our folder and say, I'm writing your story, and even though it doesn't make sense to you, even though you don't understand, I've got it covered. So let's give each other grace and compassion. Let's withhold judgment. So, as Jacob is going, he says this. He says, I'm here, God. And so God renews this promise. And he says in verse 3, I'm God, the God of your father. Don't be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you a great nation there. And I will go down with you to Egypt, and I will surely bring you up again. And Joseph will close your eyes. And so verse 5, then Jacob left Beersheba and Israel's sons and took their father Jacob and their children and their wives and their carts that Pharaoh had sent them to transport them and all their things. And so Jacob and his offspring went to Egypt, taking with them their livestock and possessions that they acquired in Canaan. So he's moving everything. I mean, everything's going, nothing's being left behind. And Jacob brought with him to Egypt his sons and his grandsons and his daughters and his granddaughters and all of his offsprings. And so he makes this promise again. Not only will he be with Jacob, but he says this, I will make you into a great nation. And this is the same promise that was spoken before, again, to Abraham. And if you remember, God speaks this promise to Abraham in chapter 12 when Abraham is really old, his wife Sarah is barren. I mean, she actually laughs out loud at the words that God speaks to them. God calls her out on it, and he says, why are you laughing? I can do anything that I want to do. And of course, God comes through on the promise, but there were many times that Abraham and his children subconsciously tried to sabotage this plan. I think both Jacob's father and his grandfather almost walked away from their wives in an attempt to save their own lives. That's a good way to sabotage the promise. They settled in lands that were not places that they should have. That's a good way to sabotage the promise. There was rape, murder, deception, and through it all, God was faithful over and over and over again. There's a long history Jacob can look back on the faithfulness of God. He's able to see the faithfulness of God, even when Jacob wanted to go and make amends with Esau. He was afraid for his life, but God did the impossible, and he changed Esau's heart from a plan to murder him to weeping on his neck and reconciling their relationship. I can imagine that Jacob often asked his dad, like my kids, tell me that story again, Dad. Tell me that story. Did Grandpa really take you up on a mountain to sacrifice you? Can you, Dad, tell me the time, one more time, where the angel stopped his hand? Can you imagine the stories that would come all the way from Abraham through Isaac to Jacob of the faithfulness of God? I can imagine that just hearing the promise that God would give to Jacob again just reignited the courage in Jacob's heart. And it was enough to displace the doubt that Jacob would have going into Egypt. And I believe this is true, that the faithfulness of God is enough to displace our doubt. And it's that boat that sinks in to the waters of doubt and just pushes them aside. The faithfulness of God, not just the future faithfulness of God, but the past faithfulness of God. It's kind of what we sing. I look back and remember that you're faithful. When we remember the faithfulness of God, it pushes out the waters of doubt. It displaces the waters of doubt. 70 people went down from Canaan to Egypt. 400 years later, the most conservative numbers are 2 million people would come out of Egypt. God fulfilled his promise. He said, I'm going to make you into a great nation. 70 went in, 2 million people came out. So what does this mean for us? It means that we remember the faithfulness of God. And we're all going to face seasons of unbelievable questioning. You might question in your life when circumstances are bleak and wrong and hard and difficult and failing. You might question things like, what am I doing wrong here, God? Are you punishing me for something? What am I doing that seems to just take away all of these promises? Maybe you'll question things like, is God good enough? Is he strong enough? If God knows, if he cares, if God's powerful enough. Maybe when we're surrounded by darkness and all of it's caving in on us, we question even the basic tenets of, does God even exist? You might question the will of God in your life. You might question the steps that you believe God to be taking you on. You might have serious doubts and questions about every area of your life. And when those questions appear, I think that all we can do is remember the faithfulness of God. When we look back into our lives and we remember the things that he's brought us through. I want to ask you, do you have some kind of system that you're able to recall the faithfulness of God? Because you have to realize and you have to understand, just think with me for a second, how quickly we are to forget. Think about generations that would come later after Jacob, the generations that would come out of Egypt back to Canaan land. They walked, what Scripture says, on dry ground as 2 columns of sea were misting on their face. And soon after they got after that, they were like, God's leading us out here to die. It's as if they just walked through this sea and now they forgot the provision of God. They were thirsty and say, God doesn't care. They were hungry and said, God isn't powerful enough to feed us. They often forgot, and we often forget too. Maybe if you have in a relationship of any kind, especially with children, you hear those words, you never let me, right? And then parents were often able to say, okay, like last week, and we start naming all the times. We forget. We often forget. So what do you do to remember? Do you write it down when you see the hand of God move? Do you tell someone? Do you put yourself out there at the risk of sounding crazy or religious to your neighbor and say, man, I can't believe what the Lord did for me this week? I just want to maybe push a few things on you. The first, I would say this, meditate. Meditate on the goodness and the faithfulness of God. Take time to think about the goodness and the faithfulness of God. Psalm 77, verse 12 says this, I will ponder all of your work and meditate on your mighty deeds. I mean, take a second. Take a few minutes this week and try to think back. Maybe journal, just start a blank page and try to just think back and write them down, bullet point them, so that you can think about those things, how God provided for you, how God pushed through, how he walked with you, how he shepherded you. We meditate on what God did. And second, we practice gratefulness. Psalm 9, verse 1 says this, I will give thanks to the Lord with my whole heart, and I will recount all of your wonderful deeds. And so we don't just stop in thinking about them, but we say, we develop this prayer time, this gratefulness moment where we would write them down. And then maybe we would spend time praying through those and just thanking God and say, God, I can't believe that, who am I that you would do this for me? And then lastly, I think that we would tell people around us so that we bring them in on our journey. We allow them to celebrate the faithfulness of God in our life, and we encourage them to do the same. Joshua 4, verse 21 and 22, he says this, when your children ask their fathers in times to come, what do these stones mean? It was a stack of stones that God had commanded the children of Israel to stack there in the river. He says this, then you shall let your children know Israel passed over this Jordan on dry ground. And he's saying this memorial, this thing that we do, this thing that we see is because of the faithfulness of God. Here's what I want to encourage you to do. Be a dispenser of the remembrance of the faithfulness of God. I mean, every time you go somewhere, speak of the faithfulness of God. Every time you have a chance to speak of anything, speak of the faithfulness of God. When you're discipling your kids, your spouse, your neighbors, your coworkers, your small group, speak of the faithfulness of God. Take every opportunity to boast in the faithfulness of God. And it doesn't just encourage you. It doesn't just protect you from those moments of doubt. It protects those around you from the moments of doubt. I mean, I guarantee you, Jacob at this point was living off of stories of the faithfulness of God of Isaac and Abraham. I guarantee you that Isaac had lived off the stories of his father Abraham, off of the faithfulness of God. And he's looking through this dark road, the road that does not make any sense, and he looks back and he says, well, God was really faithful to my dad. And he's promised me the same thing. And Jacob, he's looking down this road to Egypt, and he's saying, this doesn't make sense. Why would we go to Egypt? Why would we move everything to Egypt? But God was faithful to my dad. He's faithful to my granddad. He's been faithful to me. The faithfulness of God, I think, is translatable from generation to generation to generation. And we do that by speaking about the faithfulness of God. So I think Jacob needed this reminder as he's 130 years old. And so he says, okay, God, I'll go. In verse 8, the author here starts to recite the names of the sons of Israel that went down. He says this, now these are the names of the sons of Israel, Jacob and his sons who went down to Egypt. And so there's a list of names, and you should read them. We're going to zoom past this, but I do want to make a point about this. So why are genealogies really important? I think genealogies are really important, although sometimes they're not the most exciting, because they do two things for us. They remind us that there's no little people in the eyes of God. They remind us that everyone matters and everyone's story matters. In this story, you see the author mention in the sons of Leah, the sons of Zilpah, the sons of Rachel, the sons of Bilhah, and he names everyone, the children, the grandchildren, everybody that's coming down to Egypt. There's no little people in the story, but also it leads to Jesus and lets us know that God uses the average and the broken and the messed up people in the story of God. I love this. I love this, that God would recognize who we are and even choose to use us. You know, this story is like we've been calling it, it's kind of messed up. I mean, in these names, you have murderers, deceivers, you have human traffickers. You have a lot of messy people, and God chooses to include them. And I'm sure that they doubt it. I'm sure that they don't really understand. But I want you to fast forward with me to the last book of the Bible. Genesis chapter 21, verse 1 and 2 and 12. And he says this, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, and the first heaven and the first earth had been passed away, and there was no longer any sea. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bright and beautiful, dressed for her husband." Watch this, verse 12. "And it had great high wall with 12 gates and 12 angels at the gates." And watch this. "And on the gates were written the names of the 12 tribes of Israel." So heaven continues to write the story, not of these men, not of these people, but the story of God and how he uses broken, insufficient, unschooled, sinful people in his great story. It's amazing that this genealogy in part is given to us in Genesis here and also again in Revelation. There's a turning point in the story here where the story stops to be just about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Joseph for that matter, and it turns to the nation of Israel, the people of God. So verse 28. "So now Jacob sent Judah ahead of him to Joseph to get directions to Goshen. And when they arrived in the region of Goshen, Joseph had his chariots made ready, and he went to Goshen to meet his father Israel." I love this passage, just this great reunion that happens. And he said, "As soon as Joseph appeared before him, he threw his arms around his father, and he wept for a long time. And Israel, Jacob said to Joseph, 'Now I'm ready to die, since I've seen for myself that you're still alive.'" Can you just imagine that moment? It's as if Jacob says, "I got the last file for this folder. And now it makes sense. I can put this folder away. I can put it away in the cabinet. I can tuck it deep into my hard drive. I can put it away because now this folder is complete. I understand what's going on and what's been going on." And so Joseph is going to set his family up. He's going to provide for his family. He's going to intercede between Pharaoh and his family. It's one of the ways that scholars point to is that Joseph represents and foreshadows Jesus. That Jesus would be an interceder for us to God for us. So Joseph goes to Pharaoh and he told him, he said, "Hey, verse 1 of chapter 47, my father and my brothers and their flocks and their herds, now all they have come out of the land of Canaan, behold, they're in the land of Goshen." And so he took 5 from among his brothers and presented them to Pharaoh. I find that really interesting. I don't know why 5. Maybe he picked the cleanest 5. I don't know what his stipulations were on that 5. Maybe he still had it out for Judah. And he's like, "Judah, you stay here for a second." I don't know what it was. But he chose 5. Maybe it was just a crowded courtroom. Maybe they were practicing social distancing. I don't know. He chose 5. And he brings them to Pharaoh and he says, "These are my brothers. This is my family." And so Pharaoh asks and he says, "What's your occupation?" And so they said to Pharaoh, "Now your servants are shepherds, both we and our fathers." And so they said to Pharaoh, "We've come to sojourn in the land, for there's no pasture in your servants' flocks, for the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. Now, therefore, please let your servants live in the land of Goshen." Joseph had prepared them to respond in this way. And so then Pharaoh had said to Joseph, "Your father and your brothers have come to you, and the land of Egypt is at your disposal." Watch this. "Settle your father and your brothers in the best of the land." Think about this for a second. They come to Egypt from Canaan, and Pharaoh's instructions are, give them the very best, Joseph. "And let them live in the land of Goshen. And if you know of any capable men among them, then put them in charge of my livestock." I mean, think about this for a second. Most likely, there was a wage associated. There was a payment associated with this very high status of being the livestock keepers of Pharaoh's livestock. They come in day one, they're given this position of honor. And so Joseph's family is already being blessed by this move to Egypt. And so then Joseph brings his father in, verse 7, and I want you to see this because this is significant. And then Joseph brought his father Jacob and presented him to Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh. I don't want you to read over that because that is not insignificant. You have to understand that this is very unusual. To bless Pharaoh in the name of the Lord would imply that Jacob was superior to Pharaoh in some kind and in some way. It would follow the custom and the teaching mentioned in Hebrews chapter 7, where the lesser is blessed by the greater. So I'm sure that at some point, I don't know if Pharaoh just chalked this up to kind of this old senile man in front of him, but I'm sure at some point Pharaoh was taken back by this blessing. I mean, what did Pharaoh not have that Jacob was able to give? And how could this shepherd from another land come in and give a blessing to the one who had all the power in the world at this time? I can't imagine what Pharaoh thought initially. In fact, later on, he asks Jacob, he goes, "How old are you?" I mean, I just laugh at that because Pharaoh's probably the only person that can get away with such a question. He looks at him, he sees obviously that he's old. He says, "Wait a second, before we go on, like, how long have you lived, man?" Jacob extends his hand and pronounces a blessing over Pharaoh. I love this because I think it shares with us a principle that we can and should love by, and that's this, that God's children have the privilege and the responsibility to bless others. The children of God are intended to bless others because we carry the Spirit of God within us. Listen, Jacob had absolutely nothing on his own or in his own to bless Pharaoh by. Nothing. He was a shepherd from a town that had nothing, that was desolated by the famine. Jacob had nothing to give to Pharaoh except the Spirit of God. And we see that God blesses this Pharaoh with kindness because he kindness. Do you remember the promise that God gave Abraham in Genesis chapter 12 again? "I'll bless those who bless you, and I'll curse those who curse you." This Pharaoh gave Israel, Jacob, the best of the land, and he blessed him over and over and over again. If you read the rest of the chapter, you'll see that Joseph, through the wisdom of Joseph, Pharaoh ended up owning all of Egypt, all the livestock, all the animals, all the provisions. There was a tax that was coming in to Pharaoh that at first reading sounds a little bit harsh, but was much less than the cultural standard at that point. And so the people were happy with this Pharaoh. Pharaoh was happy with Joseph. I mean, the land prospered even during a famine because of a blessing from God. But we would see later on, 400 years later, that God curses another Pharaoh that sits on that same throne because he treats Israel very harshly and very cruelly. And so we see this blessing that comes from Jacob to Pharaoh extends even farther than that. So the question is for us. When you come into the presence of others, are you a blessing? Or maybe are you a greater blessing when you leave the presence of others? Does your life bless the people around you? Do you speak blessing over and to others? Or are your words cruel and harsh and judgmental? The people have to tiptoe around how they feel you're going to respond that day. Or do you walk into a room and say, "Hey, how can I be a blessing?" Are our coworkers blessed because we share a desk somewhere near them. Our employers blessed because we walk into the office and work with purpose. Are our families blessed because we do the things that we're supposed to do? We disciple, we play, we rest, we push. Are people blessed because of us? Are people blessed because of the Spirit of God in us? It's not just us. Are people blessed because of the Spirit of God that lives within us? This is our duty as children of God, to bless others by our presence who carries the Spirit of God. Now, verse 27. So the Israelites settled in Egypt, in the land of Goshen, and they acquired property there and were fruitful and increased greatly in number. This is the fulfilling of the promise. It seems odd, though, doesn't it, that God would take them out of the land that he promised them. So Genesis chapter 12, he calls Abraham to come out of the land. He's going to show him the land of Canaan. So eventually, Abraham doesn't really, he sojourns in the land. The only time that Abraham actually owns any property in the land is the burial site for his wife. Isaac's there a little bit. Jacob's there quite a bit. And so it seems as if God is fulfilling his promise. But then detour, although you're in the land that I gave you, here's what we're going to do. We're going to go into the land of Egypt for 400 years. You guys are going to be slaves there. And in that land, I'm going to build you up. See, I've already fulfilled the promise. I'm giving you the land, but I'm going to fulfill the promise of make you into a great nation in Egypt. And then I'm going to take you out of that land, and I'm going to take you back into the first land. Just to be honest, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I mean, when I read this, I can look at it and I can think, all right, God, why'd you have to do it in Egypt? I mean, couldn't have you had made them a great nation in Canaan? I mean, why did you send the famine all over? Maybe you could have reorchestrated this famine thing, and you could have set Joseph up in Canaan. Egypt could have come to Canaan, and like that could have been the central point, the place, the land that you had given them, the promise that you had given them. All of it could have happened at ease in this land. God's ways aren't our ways. God's thoughts aren't our thoughts. What we do know is that God was accomplishing something in this suffering that we don't know. I mean, we can look at the text and we can see the hand of God. We can see the movement of God. We can see just all kinds of things, but there's also lots of question marks in there. And that's when we look back and we see the faithfulness of God and say, maybe I won't ever have the last file that goes into this folder, but maybe I can close it and say, I'm going to just trust you. I don't have all the information, but you're the author of this folder. You're the author of this file. And so I'll just put it away and I'll just say, I'll trust you. We wait for more information, maybe until heaven. Verse 28. And Jacob lived in Egypt 17 years. I don't know if this is a coincidence, but do you remember how old Joseph was when he was sold into slavery? He was 17. It's as if Jacob, his father, got back those years. I don't know. Maybe it's a coincidence, but I just believe God blessed him with watching Joseph rule over Egypt. And these years of his life were 147. And when the time drew near for Israel to die, he's not going to die yet, but close, he called his son Joseph and said to him, if I've found favor in your eyes, then put your hand under my thigh and promise that you will show me kindness and faithfulness. We've talked about this before. It's a way that culture made an oath. It was the strongest part of your body, your thigh, your leg muscle. So you grab that, and by my strength, they were saying basically, I will keep this promise. And so he says this, do not bury me in Egypt. But when I rest with my fathers, carry me out of Egypt and bury me where they are buried. I will do as you say, he said. And so Jacob looked at him. He said, swear to me. Promise. It's important. And then Joseph swore to him, and Israel worshipped as he leaned on the top of his staff. I find this really interesting that one of Jacob's last requests is to say, don't leave me here in Egypt. Egypt had been good to Jacob. Jacob lived out the last of his days with lots of pasture and the best of the land. So why would Jacob want to be back in Canaan? I think a couple reasons. One, because God gave him Canaan, not Egypt. Canaan was home. Canaan was the promise. But I also think that Jacob might have been afraid that his children and grandchildren might enjoy Egypt too much. That the promise, the provision, the ease of life there might just be a little too appealing for his children. Later on, we see it become a problem when the children of Israel are taken into Babylon. And then the time comes where they're released and they're able to go back. And they're like, no, Babylon's cool. We like it here. And so they sent like a group of people back and they're like, 50,000 will do, but the rest of us are going to stay here. I think Jacob was afraid that they might like Egypt too much. And Egypt wasn't the promise. Canaan was the promise. But I think, honestly, it was that Jacob was homesick. He says, even though I might not ever see Canaan again, that's where I belong. And that's where I want to be. All through Jacob's life, we see this progression where he struggles. There's more information. He starts to live and lean towards God. And it's as if like his sights, his lens is starting to focus in on the promise of God. I just can't help but think of Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1 and 2, who mentions prior Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he says this, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, which would include Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. Let us throw off everything that hinders us and the sin that so easily entangles us. And let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. I love this point. Fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and the perfecter of our faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. It's as if Jesus is our Canaan. Maybe this world, this life has been really good to you. Maybe you're not very homesick for any other place. Maybe it's this life that you dread losing. Maybe it's this culture. Maybe it's this convenience. Maybe it's these comforts that you look at and you're thinking, I don't know about heaven. I don't know about, I'll stay here. I just wonder if maybe as our lens starts to focus in a little bit tighter, maybe a little bit clearer, we start to see Jesus and start to long for him. We start to throw off the things that so easily entangles us. We start to throw off the chains that so easily trap us. And like Jacob, in our days, we start saying, man, I belong with Jesus. Whatever happens, give me Jesus. I just want to encourage you with this passage today. I don't know where you're at. Maybe the Lord's calling you in some place, maybe to step out, maybe to do something of courage, maybe to take a step that doesn't seem very clear or very bright, or maybe it doesn't seem like the typical way. I would just encourage you to allow the presence of God to displace that fear. Maybe for you, you're in a place where you're starting to doubt what's going on in life. decisions that are being made, family members, jobs, all kinds of things. I would encourage you to allow the presence of God and the faithfulness to displace that doubt. And I would encourage you to tighten that lens. As you look at some of those files, the faithfulness of God, maybe some of the mysterious files where it's just a blank page and you're like, I don't know what belongs here. I don't know what goes here. I would encourage you to trust in the faithfulness of God. Would you pray with me? Lord, I thank you that you've given us stories like Jacob's and Joseph's, like the 12 tribes. You've given us stories of Canaan and Egypt, famines, provision. You've given us stories of Goshen, and you've given us stories of the desert. You've given us stories of Beersheba, where there's the altars and sacrificing, and you've given us the stories of Egypt, again, where there's fear and doubt and deceit, betrayal. Lord, you don't hide the messiness of life from us. And I thank you for that, because that encourages us to know that you can use us, that you have not abandoned us, that when we mess up, when we act in fear, when we have doubts, you're not finished with us, God. And so, Lord, I pray that even this passage would push us to a place where we tighten our lens just a little bit clearer and press on to the goal that's set before us, Jesus, the author and the perfecter of our faith. Jesus,
The empty filled, the wounded healed, the broken back together. The poor are blessed, the weary rest. We will dance forever. The blinded see, the chained are free, the doubtful now believer, the outcast known, the orphan home. You are my Redeemer. Behold, behold, behold what love can do. Behold, behold, He's making all things new. The lost return, the voiceless heard, the mourner now rejoicing. The mountains shake, the world awake, creation all composing. The said untrue, the earth renewed, the song has found its singer. The darkness light, the dead alive. You are my Redeemer. Behold, behold, behold what love can do. Behold, behold.
God, do a work in us today. God, let us take all that we have and turn it over to you. God, we pray that as we open our eyes to behold, to see you, God, that we would be changed. God, it's through your Spirit that you do this in and through us. God, and we ask that all of this would be only for the glory of Jesus, your Son. It's in his name we pray. Amen. You guys are dismissed. Be well.